The Insight. The Insightome.
Podcast.
Genetics.
Human.
Archaeology.
Denisovans.
Neanderthals.
Metabolism.
Ancestry.
Where in the world did we come from?
I am
Unique DNA.
Genome. From Austin,
Texas.
This week, a Christmas metabolism story. Okay, ho, ho, ho. It's the season.
Happy holidays.
I'm Spencer Wells,
I'm Razib Khan, Director of Content at Insightome.
and today we have a very special guest, our Director of Genomics,
Gareth Highnam. Nice to
Gareth
meet y'all.
Highnam. Great to have you here, Gareth.
What's up, Gareth?
Feels good. It's next to Razib every day. Also feels good.
So are you guys in the holiday spirit?
Yeah, well, the music is quite holidays in the office.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling it. It's Austin, so no snow, but, you know, the spirit is there.
But we did have snow this
We
year.
did have snow. We had snow like
All
2
right,
days
whatever. That was not real snow. Y'all know that was not real snow.
Anyways, we settle in for the holidays and start to think about spending time with family members and so on and celebrating. One of the things that always comes up is the meal, the Christmas meal in particular. So, December 25th, somebody's up at 5 a.m. and stuffing turkeys and sticking them in the oven. What do you guys usually have for your Christmas meal?
In my house, we're a mixed race house, Asian European, but my mom usually does something like ham, some kind of really sugary sauce to go with it, a lot of gravy, and a dessert that's pie, whipped cream, and very similar to Thanksgiving. Probably even a little more sweet than Thanksgiving.
What about you, Razib?
I think it's more traditional. My wife kind of controls that, and definitely not mixed race. So pretty traditional American food, but sometimes, we will do different things, like maybe some Italian fare where my wife has lived in Italy before. So, but in general, it's pretty traditional for Christmas because that's just the expectation, and there's kind of a plan, that we all have.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of this canonical Christmas meal, which is like some large roast beast.
Yeah,
Right.
big piece of meat.
Usually a turkey.
Yeah.
Some stuffing if you're doing turkey. So you got cornbread stuffing in the south, regular bread stuffing in the north, but really carb-filled food.
Yeah.
And maybe some cranberry sauce.
Yeah,
So that mix
basically it's obesity trifecta: fat, carbohydrates, sugars. It's all coming at you.
mashed potatoes.
Yeah,
yeah.
Gravy.
Exactly. Don't check the glycemic index on that.
Then some kind of pie, maybe.
Yeah.
Pumpkin pie. A mince pie. If you're in Britain, I lived in England for 4 years, so
Okay.
we would always
Oh,
have
yeah.
our mince pie with brandy butter. And then, speaking of brandy, there's a lot of boozing that
Yeah.
goes on at the holidays.
Yeah. A lot of people drink.
Yeah,
Those
you-
cold winter nights.
You may have some eggnog
Nog.
Yeah.
and
Warm
maybe some
cider.
wine with dinner. And then, finish it off with, I don't know, a shot of grappa if you're doing the Italian thing, as you
Okay.
mentioned.
Okay, yeah. So, the reason we bring this up, though, is this has an effect on our genetics, right, Gareth?
Well, maybe vice versa.
Okay,
genetic
yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. When it comes to evolution, it affects us and we affect it, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, the idea is, and this is referencing, for instance, the material that we cover in our Metabolism app. Your genes determine in part how you metabolize all this stuff that
Yeah.
you're about to
Yeah.
throw on your plate and into your mouth. And,
What are the side effects?
Yeah.
How do you feel the next day? What does your face look like?
Well, and so there are genetic variants that affect, how
Oh, yeah.
we're metabolizing all this stuff. So, Gareth, let's talk about, let's say, the turkey.
I mean, I was going to start with the courses as they're laid out.
Okay.
When we sit down, usually we bust out the wine pretty early or some other kind of drink.
Just relax, chillax.
As I mentioned earlier, about half of my family is Asian, genetically and individually speaking. So we're a part of the whole alcohol flush population. We also wonder about our alcohol tolerance. Asian.
So tell us
Yeah,
about
tell-
the alcohol flush.
Tell us about the flush. Some people will know, but
So if any of you guys had an Asian drinking buddy in college or seen a particularly red individual while out downtown,
Santa Claus, maybe?
yeah, maybe Santa Claus has a little flush. That is what we call alcohol flush, and it's predominantly East Asian trait. And it happens because when East Asians have this variant related to alcohol flush, they actually process alcohol differently in their liver. They have what's called an isozyme, biochemically speaking. And this fundamentally changes the speed of breakdown of the alcohol molecules that they're drinking. The gene itself is called alcohol dehydrogenase. And because of this breakdown difference, they actually begin to flush bright red.
Yeah, so it's like kind of an allergic reaction in your body.
It's
to
feedback
alcohol.
response.
Yeah.
It's feedback response. And, the alcohol dehydrogenase, I mean, like, some of the people out there, I mean, might have heard about this before. I mean, this gene has been well studied in Drosophila and in other organisms. It's a metabolic pathway that's really important for obvious reasons.
It's a coding mutation too.
Yeah. So I mean, this is very, very well studied science, and it also happens to have an impact on human variation that's quite relevant for the holiday season.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so what's the thinking behind why there is this variant? Why is there variation in the human population in how we digest or process alcohol?
Maybe that's a better question for Razib.
Yeah, I'll jump into that. I mean, this is, these sorts of adaptive theories, obviously, humans took up grain 10,000 years ago. Before that, they probably didn't drink too many fermented beverages. Partly like imagine carrying a barrel across, as a nomadic population, right?
Living as a hunter-gatherer.
So living as a sedentary population, you have grain, you have to store grain. Well, one way you can do it, and this happened in the United States for a long time, is turn it into alcohol. Alcohol keeps. It's easy to transport. Yep. It's a really good source of calories, right? But
or fuel.
Yeah.
So if we think about corn and ethanol in the Midwest
the
these
biofuels.
days,
The biofuels are a big deal. So when humans settled down, it seems like they started drinking fermented beverages really, really early. And we ferment a variety of things: barley to beer, grapes to wine, mead is honey.
I remember reading something you wrote about ancient Sumerians or Egyptians.
Yeah. Sumerians and beer was really big for the Sumerians and Egyptians. Like, there are theories that beer drove their civilization because they piled up surpluses of barley and wheat, and they had to do something with it. Another issue here is rats and mice. If you have a granary, a large proportion is going to get eaten.
And in fact, this is probably how cats became house pets.
Yeah.
They started hanging around places where there were lots of rodents and kind of domesticated themselves.
People attract pests, pests attract cats. So
one way to get around this is to turn it into something that the rodents aren't going to like.
Yeah, and obviously some other mammals can drink alcohol, but it's harder to get into a barrel than it is to crawl through some nook and cranny into a granary, right? So it's an easy way to not lose those calories, and we need to think about it from the end user perspective, like thinking in a tech sense. It's about calories, right? How do you get the calories? How do you store the calories? So they stored all these calories, and it obviously has some other side effects. People tend to enjoy it, and we have some ethnographic data, anthropological data, that when hunter-gatherer societies are exposed to alcohol, they like it quite a lot. This is not an acquired taste. This is something that people really, really enjoy, and you can't have too much of a good thing, as many of us unfortunately know in large cities in the United States. Or if you have
here in Austin, for instance. Yeah.
Or I've been to Midsummer in Finland, and you see a lot of too much of a good thing around that time when the light is still out. So there is a hypothesis that some of these feedback mechanisms, face flush, the hangovers, they're a signal to the body to rate limit how much you're intaking.
In other words, you're poisoning yourself.
Yeah.
Slow down.
Yeah, because your liver, alcohol poisoning and liver cirrhosis, liver disease, your body can only metabolize so much alcohol at any given time because in our ancient environment, we didn't drink every day. We didn't drink very often. Mm-hmm. This happens to be just a pre-adaptation.
Yeah.
And we can do it, but...
It's also interesting to point out, and this actually also came about in the East Asian populations, but there's another variant that we cover in a separate trait, which we call alcohol tolerance in the app.
Yeah.
And this actually seems to have come out in the opposite direction. So this trait makes you better at metabolizing alcohol, but the reverse feedback there is that the better you are, the actual lower tolerance you have due to the
it's a little
feedback.
Confusing.
Yeah, the buildup of kind of the intermediate products of metabolism.
It's these side effects. I mean, the side effects basically are telling you, stop, but also it's not as pleasurable. So imagine if, let's use a thought experiment to try to give an analogy of where we're going here and what we're trying to explain. Imagine you are trying to lose weight. You have a sweet tooth and you really like fatty food. If you could figure out a way to not enjoy that as much, that would actually be good for you. You would reduce
That's
your
$1 billion idea, Razib.
yeah, it is. It is $1 billion idea. So maybe I'm gonna take off right now. Go talk to some VCs, But so basically, I mean that's part of the theory here. And like these farming populations that settle down, they had to develop these sorts of feedback responses because they stockpile their grain as alcohol, and it's part of their culture. And drinking is a big part of their culture, right? And so there's these segregating variants in ancient populations that were selected to give these feedback responses to people. I mean, that's the theory here.
Yeah, and alcohol is one way of purifying water.
That's another issue.
So, it was actually useful for a lot of purposes. Okay, so getting back to the Christmas meal, we've started early with the wine.
Yeah.
And then think about the turkey and the stuffing and the mashed potatoes and maybe the green beans or the Brussels sprouts. We've got this mix of vegetables and starches and meat. What about that stuff?
That takes us pretty much directly into our fat trait, which is in a gene called FADS, and there is a range.
It's a class of genes.
Oh yeah,
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, and these genes are involved in a cascade of things, and there's a whole bunch of different what we call haplotypes, variations of groups of mutations in these genes that indicate a lot about ancestry, the types of diet that you're basically most compatible with, and these have really interesting selection stories. Maybe Razib, you want to talk about some of that?
When you look at these, not to get too much into the weeds, into the genetics, there's a lot of variation around this locus. We are omnivores. Some vegans will tell you differently, but I don't want to get...
Yeah, so we evolved, and that's part of the reason we can sustain such a large brain, it's thought, is that instead of just being vegetarian, like a lot of our primate ancestors, we introduced meat into the diet, which is very calorie-rich, has a lot of nutrients in it. And, given that our brain uses, I think, 25% of the calories that we consume every day, I mean, it's really expensive energetically to have this big
It's expensive tissue, so we need dense sources of calories. So it could be nuts is one, fruit, meat. We are omnivores. We will eat pretty much anything. But different populations,
different efficacy.
Well, they have different mixes of what they will eat, right? So an Inuit is a classic example. Inuit and Eskimo, the people of the Arctic, they don't consume much vegetable matter because there's not much to consume.
Right. Yeah, so not a lot of salad places to grab a Caesar.
Yeah,
up
exactly.
There. You're living off of animals. If you're living inland, you're living off of reindeer. If you're on the coast, you're living off of fish, marine mammals.
Yeah, and I know that Inuit and Eskimo, they are known to eat seaweed from some of the animals, stomachs of the animals they kill.
You got to get your green somehow.
You got to get your green. Yeah, if it's like meat only, you're starting to crave a little bit of vegetable matter, right? You get some deficiencies otherwise. So they try to make up for that. Then there's other populations.
Let's stop there though, because that's a pretty extreme diet. How have they adapted to the high levels of fat and protein and so on in that diet?
It looks like there's a selection event for a particular variant at that FADS locus, where basically they don't process their input as in the same. They don't produce the same amount of fatty essential acids because they get it in their diet. Right? There seems like there's some sort of trade-off we see in the evolutionary data from several research labs that this has been varying in the ancestral human population, and the fraction of each variant that has a different disposition to be able to process these sorts of vegetable fats varies by population. So there's some sorts of complex trade-offs that we don't totally know the details of. But some populations have more vegetable matter.
Right.
And
so they've been, in some cases, vegetarian for many thousands of years. We're thinking about people in southern India, for instance. And so what do we see there with the FADS variant?
Well, we see the opposite, where their FADS loci, they're better at synthesizing the essential fatty acids. Right.
And research has shown that they actually have a really distinct indel mutation that
What's an
confers
indel?
that
What's an indel?
an insertion, a large insertion of DNA.
So it's a
that
big mutation.
Aren't found really outside of that region that confers that vegetarian preference or that ability to be vegetarian.
Yeah. I mean, they can make more out of the vegetarian diet than an Inuit would, right? And an Inuit does better on the meat diet than on the vegetarian diet. Now, this does not mean that even someone who's from a population that is ubiquitously vegetarian or someone that's from a population that's ubiquitously meat eating, they would not benefit from a little diversity, right? But they didn't have supermarkets in the recent past, so they had to make do. Humans are good at making do. That's why we're on 6 continents, right? I mean, we can forage and survive pretty much anywhere.
We're adaptable. We're the coyotes of the primate world.
Yeah, we're generalists. We're generalists, and that shows in our genome. Our genome has a lot of variation.
Shows on our dinner table.
Exactly. I mean, this quote traditional Christmas dinner. I mean, people of a whole host of ethnicities from different parts of the world, they can all partake of it. Now, the responses might be somewhat different. Like the alcohol part we already indicated.
Yeah.
But and it's not just meat. Obviously, we're talking about carbs. That's also another locus we look at.
Yeah, so let's get on to the carbs. Let's talk about the starches in the diet. Now, there is a variant that we are not reporting on, or a gene that we're not reporting on yet in metabolism, but we're going to be adding it in the new year when our partner Helix is able to call the variants. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so just like fat metabolism with the FADS genes, there's another set of genes called amylase, which we call AMY. There's about 3 of them, depending on how you look at it. And the numbers of copies of these genes that you have actually affect your ability to metabolize carbohydrates.
So there have actually been duplications and triplications and quadruplications and so on of these genes. You've got multiple copies sitting in your genome, and they're all like cranking out, copies of this.
They're all cranking out
gene,
the same,
which become the enzyme, and so it affects the level of the enzyme.
Yep.
So if you have more copies of this gene, you're producing more of this AMY enzyme, amylase.
Yeah.
With more amylase, the better you are at metabolizing carbs.
Starch.
And Razib, is there a correlation between people with high levels of amylase and how long they've had these high levels of starch in their diet?
So yeah, there's been literature that's been published that shows that populations that are much more grain heavy in their diet, and grains have a lot of starch, connect the dots there, have a greater copy number of amylase in their genome, and so they produce more of the enzyme in their saliva.
So is there something ancestral between FADS and amylase you think you could look at to actually find out where a person is from?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
The haplotype structure. There should be some geographic information.
But I mean, you're right. There is, if you look at haplotype structure, but I mean, that's a little more complicated. But in general, like what I would say with a lot of these things is there's a lot of variation that is within populations.
Yeah.
Except for the Asian facial flush, for example, we talked about, if someone has 2 copies of that, it's highly likely they're from Northeast Asia.
Sure.
But with amylase and with FADs, there's a lot of variation. Now, to be fair, with the Inuit, they've swept, they're like at one end of the distribution, and some Indian populations are at the other end, but most populations are in between. Most people are omnivorous.
I ask because when we look at this in research papers, usually see geographic distribution.
We do.
Shout out to Alon Keenan because he also had a great paper on the European and Bronze Age selection of the FADS genes.
Yeah. Let me just pause, give shout out to Alon. Like a lot of what we're talking about here.
Alon Keenan, a professor at Cornell University.
A lot of what we're talking about here is from his work, and also like the Rasmus Nielsen's group at Berkeley, the Center for Theoretical Biology. In any case, Alon and his group, they looked at the Pleistocene, and what they saw was
Pleistocene being
Ice Age.
The Ice Age.
Ice Age.
So before agriculture.
Yeah. So they looked at from 40,000 years to the present, and what they saw is let's call it the meat-eating variant of FADS, increased in frequency over the Ice Age. And then when agriculture shows up in Europe, decreased in frequency, right? And so what this is showing is things have gone in one direction and they've gone back. We're an adaptable population, and it's not like we're going in one direction.
Sure.
We're going in the direction that's useful.
Would you say that it increased in frequency because we had to be better at eating meats, and then decreased in frequency not because the meat eaters were dying, but because those who were less adaptable to the meat-heavy diet we're increasing in population.
Well, I mean, so what we do know is synthesizing the essential fatty acids, the vegetarian variant is much better at that.
Yeah, and we know that the amount of meat in the diet dropped as populations became agricultural,
Oh, I
so
see.
they started
So maybe it
subsisting
really was
mostly.
a
Yeah.
situation.
So I mean, I think that there is some benefits to the meat eating variant, but it's not as clear to me. But there obviously is. Like, there's some relationship with omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. There's another story. Don't want to get into the weeds there. The vegetarian one is very obvious. There's essential fatty acids that it's better at producing that variant when you don't have it in your diet.
Okay, so we've covered like this amazing omnivorous meal with the meat and the starches and the vegetables, and now it's on to dessert,
Which
and
I'm
we've
not
got
a big fan of.
And we've got a big slice of pie that's chock full of sugar, and it's topped with some whipped cream.
Oh, yeah.
Which of course has lactose in it.
Yep.
So what's the story there?
This is another trait that we again cover in the metabolism map, the lactose tolerance. Lactose, this actually come about in a number of different variations that we look at, just due to the rise of pastoralism and agriculture across the world.
Yeah, so just to set the stage here, the ancestral kind of state for mammals is we can all digest the sugar in milk, lactose, when we're born because we're drinking milk. That's how that's what makes us mammals, and it's what allows us to survive. By the time we wean, typically we lose that ability. We actually stop making the enzyme known as lactase, and so the standard condition in adult mammals is you are lactose intolerant. But in a few societies, in the Middle East and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Nilo-Saharan groups, probably not independently in India. It seems like the variant came in from the Middle East, but basically in a few locations, people started to raise animals for meat initially, so cattle, sheep, goats, and they realized that instead of killing them, they could actually, harvest their milk, and that was a really good food source. But the problem is, if you're not a little kid, you can't digest it. So there was strong selection for this, and we end up with lactose tolerance in places like Europe and the Middle East, parts of Africa, and India.
Yeah. So a third of the calories in raw milk is in that sugar. So you're leaving a third of the calories on the table if you're not digesting it. And also people who are quote unquote lactose intolerant, which is the ancestral state.
Strong immune reactions, right?
Well, I mean, if you have a lot of sugar that goes into your gut that's not digested, bacteria can digest it.
Yeah. So, you get a gaseous effect.
That's
but in
mild.
addition,
That's
but in
mild.
addition, there's an osmotic effect. And so, your body's trying to equalize kind of the water levels inside the gut and in the gut passageway. And so basically a lot of water flows out into your intestine, and the rest is history.
after
It's
that.
not good. Yeah, I mean, which is so as you reduce the sugar in milk product, or that sugar, the lactose sugar in milk products, it's actually easier for people who are intolerant to digest. So, for example, hard cheeses are much easier for people who are lactose intolerant than raw milk.
And even yogurt to a certain extent.
Yeah, because it's been fermented, it's been broken down,
Yeah.
so the sugar quantity is actually dropping, right? But be as that may be, we got the raw milk. If you're a pastoralist, you're on the move. You probably do eat a lot of cheese, but sometimes you just need to drink the raw milk. And so there's been really, really, really strong selection in the genome for this really strange mutant variant multiple times, as Gareth said. In Eurasia, at least once. That variant is from Northern Europe to India. We have one in the Middle East.
We even have a variant from camels. I think that is the Middle
Yeah,
Eastern
so
one.
there's a hypothesis that camel domestication is the one that drove the Middle Eastern one.
Camel milk.
Yeah, I've never
Never
have
had it
you had
myself.
camel milk, Spencer?
I have not. I've had horse milk. Fermented. They drink it in Central Asia. It's something called kumis.
Yeah.
I've had a very similar Mongolian version of that.
Yeah, it's the same. So, but obviously there's really strong selection pressure. Some of these populations drink a lot of milk, and they can't leave a third of the calories on the table, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's why, humans are so strange, because it is really strange that we can, digest lactose sugar as adults.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's just where there's a will, there's a way. Evolution, makes it work.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
I love
So-
my cheese.
I do too. Luckily, I'm lactose tolerant. So we've got the whipped cream. What about all the sugar in the pie and also in the whipped cream?
Oh, yeah. Sugar is obviously a big deal for us humans. We need to metabolize it. We need to deal with it.
So what's the gene that's involved in helping us to metabolize sugar? And there are lots of them, of course, but
Sure.
there's one that we talk about.
The
in
gene for this
metabolism.
specific trait, and the one that we cover in the Metabolism app, is TCF7. And this one is particularly involved in our glucose metabolism, our ability to bring our blood sugar down, which is obviously very important for...
So let's get into the biochemistry for a minute, because I basically had a double major in biology and chemistry. I'm a bit of a chemistry geek. Sucrose is a sugar. Glucose is a sugar. Cellulose is actually sugar. So all of that, woody material in plants is actually sugar. Sugars are actually plants' ways of storing the energy from the sun. They're kind of like plant batteries.
They are.
So, all the photons are absorbed. You take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the plant magically creates sugars as a way of storing energy. And we, as animals, can eat those sugars and digest them and regain that energy later on from the sun. So, again, they really are kind of like batteries in that sense.
They are, yeah. Sucrose, starch, glucose, they're all sugars at different densities.
Yeah. Some of them we can digest, some of them we cannot. Like cellulose.
Yeah, but there are bacteria, of course,
Yeah.
that can digest that. And if you think about, adaptations in, mammals, that's the reason cows have multiple stomachs, because they've got all these bacteria that are digesting all these
And
things.
they digest the bacteria.
Yeah, so it's a really cool story. So what's the selective story on this gene that's involved in glucose metabolism?
Again, this goes back to grain. Grain is a big deal.
It is
we
a big
call, we, as in people in the West, call wheat the staff of life. That actually is a relatively recent innovation in the grand scheme of human evolution over the last 10,000 years. In East Asia and in South Asia, that's rice, which is, I think, the primary food for almost half the human race is rice, right? You're basically carb loading your whole life. This is not the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, as evolutionary psychologists would say. Our ancestral environment had a much more diverse portfolio of food sources, meats, various herbs, nuts, maybe fruits, seafood. There's all sorts of things. Now, in a lot of local cuisines, obviously there is diversity, but we have to understand that in the pre-modern world, in a Malthusian environment where population densities are high, most people are not eating like that except for on holidays. Most people day to day would eat, a lot of times it would look like gruel to us. Whether it would be like a barley, wheat, or rice gruel.
Mid-Neolithic, you're a villager, you're a subsistence farmer, and even, in a lot of places around the world today, in the developing world, you visit villages and people are living on porridges and gruels and, very basic forms of, extracting energy from the starches in the grain. Now, the starches in the grains are relatively complex carbs, but ultimately, you want to break them down into these simple sugars because your body is using glucose. I mean, that's the stuff that's actually powering that brain, for instance.
Yeah.
So glucose is a good thing if you have to work to get it, in a sense.
Yeah.
But the problem is, we figured out how to industrially mass-produce sugar, first in India through sugarcane, but, it spread into Europe more recently. And then in the 19th century, all hell broke loose, and suddenly sugar is everywhere, and we've got this huge excess of sugar in our diets. And this is a problem today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, this is the issue. Also, like refined versus processed foods. It gets the calories to you fast, but our body's biochemistry is actually not designed to always run at that speed, right?
You've always got your pancreas turned on with all that sugar.
Yeah, everything is always like upped up, especially since today our activity levels are dropping, our consumption levels are increasing. So if you just do the basic, the balance of energies, we have some issues here. And some populations have had issues far longer in terms of you change your nutrient portfolio instead of having like vegetables with fibers and meats and fats and protein. It's carbs day in and day out, day in and day out.
It's definitely a farmer-related trait here.
And you can survive. You can survive on that, obviously, because there are billions of people the vast majority of the human population is descended from people that lived on gruels. But that has an effect on your genome because different people have different set points of how fast and how well they can metabolize these sorts of things. And so this is what that metabolic trait that we're looking at, that insight
And so
is the product of.
in the trait, we talk about glucose tolerance.
Yeah.
And where is the kind of peak and where is the trough in terms of the distribution of the variant that we're looking at?
Yeah, again, we got to look at Asia, East Asia in particular. It probably just has to do with the fact. Now, there are other genes that affect this trait. Obviously, we are looking at a specific genetic story that we have extremely high confidence in, at a specific gene. Setting that aside, we're looking at East Asia. East Asia transitioned to rice, depending on where you're looking, 5 to 10,000 years ago. Rice probably was domesticated. There's still some arguments, but definitely like the lower Yangtze, like where Shanghai is today, that region, and it spread mostly to the south and west. From there, some to Japan, Korea, obviously, a little bit into North China, but not too much. In any case, these are extremely dense populations that lived on rice.
So basically what you're saying is if you were to look at the frequency of the variant, that it's very high around this Yangtze area.
Yeah. But if you look at Tibetans, who aren't that genetically different, but their diet is not so carb heavy, they drink a lot of milk, yak milk, other things like that. They do not have
yak
the same
butter tea. I've had it. It's an acquired taste.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know all about that, Spencer. All I'm saying is this is definitely a high frequency in agriculturalists from East Asia.
Okay.
Yak butter tea, though? Can we talk about that for 1 second?
Yak butter tea. Yeah, so...
Wait, have you had that too?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, all over Central Asia, they make this savory tea. So we think of tea as being something that you add cream and sugar to, and it's a sweet drink, kind of desserty. In Central Asia, they add salt and they add butter to it. So it's like a meal.
It reminds me of butter coffee.
Oh,
Maybe it's not such an exotic concept.
Bulletproof.
Yes.
Bulletproof.
So the Tibetans were bulletproof.
They knew about
before
bulletproof.
Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is
Wow.
reinventing Tibetan culture.
I love it. Okay, so we've covered everything in our meal pretty much.
I think so.
And the cool thing is, our listeners, if you're curious about how you metabolize all this stuff and about your story, you can check out our app and find out more. Okay, well, happy holidays, everybody.
You too, Spencer.
Happy holidays to you guys.
Yeah, take care.
For more information about Incytome, our podcasts, and our genetic products, check out our website at incyto.me. That's INSITO.me.